Today we have with us Yasi Alipour, an Iranian artist and writer based in Brooklyn. She holds an MFA from Columbia University and is currently an assistant professor at the Rhode Island School of Design. Her work explores mathematics, time, and histories of erasure using paper and various intricate folding techniques.
Types, which has kind of happened randomly. But it's been really nice having a couple of years of just being with the blues in a way that makes sense with the folds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. So, like the blue looks like the sea, but it's like a process that, like cyanotype is obviously like sun printing. So I think that's just really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's the sun, and it's so fascinating because when I think about the sea, I think the sun is also a big part of it. Like, I grew up I grew up in the capital in Iran, but my family's on both sides. They come from regions near the Caspian Sea. So I think some of my earliest lessons has been about like knowing how to be by the water. So it's like how to behave at the beach, how to deal with like a wave, like very literal, like as
Yeah.
soon as you start walking, how to eat a fish, like a specific fish that belongs to that body of water. But the sun is a really big part of all of it, like the quality of the sun. And then the other part, I mean, cyanotypes are really interesting because they are sun prints, but they're also really related to water. Like,
Exactly.
water was not part of my folding. It was like literally when folding stopped for me because paper becomes very fragile. Like, everything is in flux the moment you even deal with humidity. But you have to like kind of put the paper back in the water.
Yeah.
So yeah, things got really watery. I'm also a Pisces. I'm like a sucker for the beach. I'm like, I just want to return to the water.
That's
Yeah.
wonderful. Yeah. I live in the middle of a desert, so I can like understand.
Oh.
Yeah.
Did you grow up there too?
Yeah. So I'm in like
Yeah.
Rajasthan, which is most of it is desert.
Yeah.
Even though I live in Jaipur, it's still one, it's really hot, but two, it's like art, landscape, and also like everything around us, even in like terms of culture, is made up of like,
Mm.
the connection to like camels and like the imagery of the
Oh.
desert. And also like I think the
Yeah.
predominant color here is like tones of like pink and ochre, just because of
Mm.
like the influence of the sand.
Mm. Wow. No, it's so amazing because I've been thinking a lot about this, kind of like almost how our brains like understands different kinds of landscapes. I'm currently at Dartmouth and it's like really mountainy and really green.
Yeah.
And of course, this country has a really intense history. So I feel like there's a lot of echoes of history of colonization when you're in like such a rich landscape like this.
Mm-hmm.
But also I'm like, I don't know how to be in mountains, you know? And then it's like I have friends who grew up by the mountains or have elders who come from that space. And then like their imaginary is always going back to that space. Or I had a friend who's from Arizona, which is like a big desert, and she was telling me that she misses the sound, like that the sound quality
Yeah.
is different, you know? She's like, I miss that landscape, or like even what the horizon looks like. So it's like it's all related, but we get to it differently. And we also like learn like what is wise, like what is safe, like what are the things you mess
Yeah.
with, what are the points you step back, you know?
I agree.
Yeah.
It also just like makes up how you navigate other landscapes too. So if you've just grown up in a certain kind of terrain, the way you
Yeah,
walk will be influenced by that, for sure.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I did want to ask you about like more detail in more detail, like your work with
Yeah.
cyanotypes. So I think like because you do cyanotypes and also like the ink printing, a lot of the
Mm.
color in like all of the color basically I think in your work is like blues and then black and then white.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
are you thinking about color in that intentional way, or is it just like a byproduct of like the process?
I think neither in like a really weird way. Color has always been really hard for me. And I think the way I would describe it is like least until this point in my practice, it's always monochrome. You know, it's kind of, I'm like in a field of color. I think the closest I've come to kind of dealing with like these coming together is when I dyed my cyanotypes with tea, like turns the color. But once again, you enter another field. And I think like for me, the reason or the way I understand it, the question for me always goes back to folding. Like that's the beginning, and that's like the desire for making comes from that space. And then there's kind of the vulnerability of wondering when things become visible. And that is like, this is something I'm thinking a lot about these days. That's both for me and for my viewers. Now that's like different. And sometimes I have a huge ego and I want compliments. I want to make pretty things. And sometimes it's literally I need, like on a deeper level, I think it's been such a gift to have the chance to show my work, because seeing it with others helps me see it. Yeah. But the question has remained the same. Like folding in itself is kind of an invisible drawing.
Yeah.
And now that level of how it becomes legible changes slightly. I like to tell the stories. I don't know if you've seen it. But I started folding when I was in middle school. And I never folded anything fun. My friends wanted me to make those like fortune-telling things. I never figured it out. I can make boats, but that's it. Beyond that, but I can make very tiny ones. Beyond that, it has always been like mathematical.
Yeah.
And I would like give it to people. I wanted others to take care of it, but it would be like utterly invisible. And then it was like much later when I was in high school, I think my third year in high school, perhaps not shockingly, but it came out as a surprise for me. I had a geometry teacher, and I didn't love geometry. I still don't think of them as geometry. I think of them as kind of math games for me. But I had a geometry teacher, and she was really supportive, and I used to show her the work.
Yeah.
And she used to tell me about these woman mathematician who folded and who would have pieces of paper in their pockets. And I remember that image. But she was the one. She was like, make it three-dimensional, it's going to become visible. And it was like so literal. But it also opened such a wild field, because there's an in-between moment of when things are folded or when paper is no longer three-dimensional, like being in that space. And then I continued doing that. And I didn't consider folding as a fine art practice at all. Like my brain couldn't comprehend how it could be its own thing. I considered architecture, it didn't work. I studied computer science, I thought I was done. I started photographing my friends. But when folding came back to me, I was like, okay, but how do I make it visible? And it came back to me as in I continued folding, but I wasn't showing it until much later when I was in an art school for photography. And it was a friend who encouraged me to put it like on the board where we do crits. And then since then, it has continuously been a process of like, okay, but how legible? When is the point of legibility? And what can help me in that process? Oddly enough, like after working with the paper as I had done in these like slightly sculptural moments, I shifted instantly to photography because that was the space I was in. So I was working with darkroom photography. I was working with negatives.
Yeah.
And oddly enough, I always did color. Like I knew I didn't want to do black and white photography. Why? I have no idea. But it's so interesting because I think that's the most I've done to having like work that is not monochromatic. But even with that, because it was like an weird process, I didn't have a lens. But I worked in a color darkroom, so the colors were relative. It wasn't my decision. It was light that decided what the colors were.
Got it.
It was between the light and it was between the light and whatever the negative holds. So all of this to say, a couple of years later, when I was in grad school, I remember there was this like person who studied like glass or something, and is like a painter, sculptor, and he was very judgy. And he was like, "You obviously don't understand color." And I never like forget that sense. I was like, oh. And even today, like I think about it, I think by that, like he meant like color theory in the sense that it relates to Goethe. And I'm like, yeah, I don't. Even though sometimes I go to a museum and just study like the blues, I just like follow and see how it happens in different histories. Or when I think about architecture in Iran, it's always about color. But yeah, I don't think about it in relation to Western painting. I don't think of much in relation to that. So yeah, I got really shy about it though. I was like, okay, I guess I don't. And then the black paper kind of found me. It was like accessible, it was around, and then it was suddenly legible in a very specific way. And then cyanotype kind of happened by an accident like that. And full transparency, like I think I'm at a moment, like then I returned to the paper itself after. Just like in the recent shows, I have more and more works that are just the paper. Also, my understanding of paper has really improved. But yeah, these days I do wonder if there's another color, you know? I'm like, and then this morning I was like, what is the difference between like painting and dyeing, you know? Because like there's something about what happens when the paper is dyed, what it like absorbs the color, you know? But I move very slowly. Like my variables are very little. And the way I deal with color, it has to make sense with the process of folding. It has to I never wanted to illustrate or highlight the folds, because then what was the point of folding? Like I always go back to that. Like if I was gonna highlight the lines with like a color pencil, then it would become legible, like from the beginning. Like I had a charcoal, I could highlight it. But then it was the drawing. Like then I had reduced what was the fold to what was the drawing on the surface. You know, so on some level I was hiding the folding. Yeah.
So this is literally going to be my next question.
Yeah.
But like does basically like the ink from the printer or like the cyanotype mess with the folds or like flatten the folds?
Yes and no. Mostly no. So for majority of paper, I mean, it's really interesting. So with the black paper, which is like the toner from printers, that I make my paper first. So I go in with the black paper.
Got it.
I have never tried printing on it after folding, mostly because it's digital printers. And I think it's just like the way it's gonna filter the paper, like that doesn't make sense to me. With the cyanotypes, I'm actually exploring that right now. Just like for a long time, I made the paper first, like I coated the paper, then I folded. These days I'm folding a lot and then coating the paper. For the vast majority of papers, folds are within the paper. It stays. It becomes less visible, but if I can find my line, if I know where my line is, then it's there. Like it just pops off, basically.
Yeah.
There's some very light. Yeah, I had one experience, I think it was some ash paper, where it kind of dissolved the paper in a way that the folds were like I couldn't find them. And then etching is slightly different because I think because of the weight of etching and how it's layered, how it is made to respond to pressure, it reads differently whether I fold before or after. I can't really explain it, but it's different.
That makes sense. That's really interesting. I think it also relates to what you said about like the fold existing between like dimensions. You also talked a little bit about like, you know, how you think about folding mathematically more than geometrically. So I also like watched a talk that you gave at Dartmouth where you talked about like algorithms. So I just was wondering like how do you like how do you choose the algorithms that you kind of like incorporate into each piece,
And
Yeah.
like you said, you map out your folds before you start. Do they ever change while you're working?
Yeah, so map out is a good verb. It's a good verb because I don't map out in the sense that we usually use it, but I do like maps, so maybe I do. So basically, it's kind of an ongoing process, and like a lot of what happens in the folds like comes from what happened before. Like whenever I have like an invitation, like a solo exhibition, majority of what I do is like look at what happened in the past like couple of months, like kind of since the last one.
Yeah.
Because I don't go in being like, this is what I'm going to conquer. I just make excuses to keep folding. Like the only consistent is finding inspirations to keep folding. And then having material, like literally always having a gathering of papers that are interesting. So what happens is like usually there's like a number of questions that are interesting for me. Like once, and a lot of time they come from before, like things are fairly cyclical. But once again, I'm really, right now I'm back at thinking a lot about the nearly three-dimensional. It's so funny. It's usually not in language. And then like shifting centers, like kind of different steps. But like that's incredibly vague. And even in my head, it's incredibly vague. And I'm usually just continuing what I was folding before.
Oh.
And then what happens is, and this relates to the second part of your question. So I say I don't map out because there's no like notes somewhere or like drawing something out. Like my studio is crazy right now because yesterday was very exciting. I'm also a bit sleep deprived because of it. But basically, like, I don't know, this is a paper that was like in one of my notebooks, you know? And I'm like, oh, like right now, I'm really into circles within circles, kind of shifting up and down. I can't really recall why, you know? But I'm like, okay, so basically what I want to do going in, like something I want to try today is I want to make one big circle, one that is like a third up, a third east, and then going up and east again. And last night before sleep, I was trying to visualize what it would look like, but I really can't. Like, I can't imagine them before folding, you know? And they're always different. Or things come up, like things that I learned while doing it. So it's almost like a pseudoscientific assignment, you know? I'm like, oh, I have to like figure this out. And then whatever the fold is has also on some level needs to be interesting for my hands. Yeah. And that is different than my brain because it's time consuming and I have to find my rhythm. So I'm like, okay, I'm committing a couple of hours. So on some level, my hand's questions are slightly different than my hand. Like my hand is really into these guys right now, and it happened fairly randomly. I told you the studio is crazy right now. You know, so I know they're so like they're satisfying to my hand. You know, I'm like, whoo. So then, there's a bit of negotiating those things, you know. But even with that, I'm like, okay, I got work. This is gonna keep me busy for a while. So what happens is, and that has been through since the time I started folding. I'm working on one kind of form or pattern and like a set of questions, like what, like with the circles, right? And then I make new problems. What would it be like if it's bigger? What would it be like if it's a different paper? What would it be like if it's a cyanotype? What would it be like if it's more detailed, right? And each of these things, I can't imagine it until I do it. So it's excuses to do things. And then in the process of doing, to kind of get to the second part of your question, a lot of times, and especially now that things are more time consuming, somewhere in the middle, I start figuring something out and I'm like, that's too good. Like, I think it's figuring something out. Like, I have to like stop touching it. And because of like the way the folds work, I can always start again. I can always like go back, start
Yeah.
anew, and finish another piece. But there's a lot about having things unfinished, like a third done, repeated, like kind of creating a notation with it that has happened through the process of making, you know, and seeing where it takes me. So usually in my world of making, like kind of the same group of things. And then every once in a while, I find like I see something in the world. So it can be a diagram, it can be an architectural site, it can be like a book about design, you know? And then that can shift things. Like this came from like a book about folding and design. And it was like one page. I usually like, if a book is really interesting for the folds, and with all honesty, there's only been 2 books, usually I never go beyond 1 page, you know, because I become so excited in like figuring that out that then that becomes the whole thing. And then it becomes part of the vocabulary. Like more or less, I can name almost like between 7 to 10 different forms that repeat in my work. And then that's it. Like everything that has happened is a combination of these things. So they keep me busy. And then these days people send me more weird drawings, which is delightful. Because a lot of times if it is fairly algorithmic, if people send me something visual, there's times where I'm like, oh, I can fold that. And then that's a really delightful problem for me. I'm like, it's going to take me like a couple of days to be like, do I have it right? And again, it's not about counting and drawing. It's about like folding and being like, oh no, I'm wrong here. So it's also kind of, in that way, it feels connected to the history of making that is close to what I'm doing, you know? Like completely out of my hand.
That makes sense. That's really beautiful. And also, it seems like such a superpower to be able to fold things that people just send you. That's so interesting.
Thank you. I do think it's a superpower too. A really dear friend who's writing my essay for the catalog that's coming up at Dartmouth sent me this. This is the new one. I could try to show you. Give me a second. She sent me a drawing. I had used the word tessellation with her, and she just became really interested about what this word means, which usually I think about in relation to tile work, especially in the history of Manassa. And then she sent me this drawing, and then I was like, oh, I could fold it. You know?
That's beautiful.
Thank you. It's one of the new friends. And it was in the middle of like, I was busy folding other things, but it's so satisfying. And for a whole day, especially since we've been in conversation about my work, I kept sending her being like, I'm close, I figured it out. And then I was like, no, I don't have it, I was wrong. And it was so interesting because she told me, she was like, well, Yasi, I think you're the only person in the world who can be like, it's right or wrong. Because it's related, you know? And I was like, no, in my head, it's absolutely like, I don't have the answer yet. But I got it. I finally got it. After thinking I was wrong like 4 times, I got it. And then now I'm trying to realize a bigger version of it with cyanotypes, which also helps me understand how the repetition affects the forms. Like how they can support each other in their repetition. So they keep me busy.
That's really beautiful. I feel like the way that you described it, about it being like absolutely right and wrong, I feel like that's the beautiful thing about math. So the reason that like I love math and people love math is because you know where you have to get to. But the thing about art is that you know the process. You don't know where you're getting to. So I feel like your practice like merges the two together, and that's so beautiful.
Yeah, no, I appreciate this so much. I mean, it's so funny because I teach a lot, you know? And one of the classes I teach a lot of art history, I teach a lot of crit. Those things, I'm a nerd, I'm happy. But I also teach drawing and like experimental drawing. I had a teacher a long time ago. She was teaching me color darkroom, and she was really big in my fold, Elaine Metzek. And I really appreciate how she talked about experimental art. Because she was like, think of yourself as a scientist. Like, a scientist doesn't change all the variables at the same time, because otherwise you won't know what caused the change.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, that is language I understand. So that's why I'm like, that in itself has like affected everything. Where I'm like, oh, I know, like, this time I'm making it more detailed. Next time I'm making it bigger, you know?
Yeah.
But then, like, I think about this a lot, or just like, yeah, there is something about moments where math can feel like puzzles, you know? And you're piecing it together.
Exactly.
And you have the proof. Like, I loved like logic, because it was like, to me, such a game. You know, we had 4 things, you moved it around, and then you were like, oh, you built something. And then I had this very specific moment that like kind of decided it for me. I was studying computer science. My community was full of engineers and like mathematician and like math friendly people. And I had a really dear person in my life who continued and like has a PhD in mathematics now. But I remember sitting with him, and we were studying for the same exam. We were in college, like, I don't know. It was some math course. And we were reading some proof. And this happens in mathematics, which is like kind of in more advanced math. Like, 2 things happen at the same time that were the way math and pedagogy works, which is like, first you go to college and they finally tell you that all of this is made up system. You know, like forever you're like, but why is 0 a number? And then if you like, as a child, if you're like, I'm confused, how is 0 a number? They're like, and then the words they use, at least in Farsi, we use the same terms as English, which is so loaded. They're like, that's primitive thinking. And I'm like, well, excuse me, you know? Anyway, so they kind of open it for you. And you're like, oh, these are made up. And like, we're building worlds and we're imagining things. And it is close to art. But the other thing that happens is that, especially on the undergraduate level, they're trying to cover a very specific history and like a really long time of different thinkers. Mm-hmm. So you're constantly reading other people's proofs without the stories, you know? You're like, this is how this works. And you're like, you know? And it's like 20 lines. And it's no longer something you would come up with.
Makes sense.
It's like something, and then like later on, like now looking back, I'm like, oh yeah, it's something like that mathematicians like worked on for like hundreds of years, and then like for 50 years collaborated with each other nonstop before proving, you know? Anyway, so I was back in that room studying with a friend. Yeah. And I remember he was reading this proof, and he was like, wow, that's beautiful. And I just remember sitting there, I was like, I don't feel it. Like, I've never felt like that depth of this is beautiful reading a proof. And it's also a lot about how kind of academic mathematics is written, you know? Somewhere along the way, I was like, cool, you did it. I can't do it. I'm going to memorize it. I'm going to repeat it, but I'm done. I'm out. And to me, there's something so specific about like, you know, like that's the joy and like the weirdness of art, where I'm like, sometimes I'm like, we kind of choose to do it on some level. Like everything's at stake, but also nothing's at stake.
Yeah.
Like what a gift to be able to do this. But also for me, it allows me to bring a lot of the histories that I can no longer read, you know? It's like a while back, I used to tell people in any of my talks, I would kind of end it being like, I would love to know more like women who are mathematicians, people of color, queer folks, you know? I want the weirdo mathematicians. And I would just pose it to the room. It was like, if you know some people, I want some weirdos. And then it was so funny because every time someone would come up to me and they'll be like, I know someone. I know this professor somewhere. And it was usually like, I don't know, a dude from the Middle East. Where I'm like, those guys are my friends. Like, I grew up with them, but I don't mean them. And then it took me longer to be like, well, actually, I do know those mathematicians. Agnes Martin, for me, is a mathematician. Serena Hashmi, like, studied math. Like, what do you want from her? She is a mathematician. Etal Adnan studied philosophy. Like, she is a logician. So I'm like, this relationship, especially for women and, like, femme folks, where you're like this dry language that refuses the body, that claims that everything about math is about imagining without material, like in an absolutely no physicality space. If you're someone that your every move in the world, like you're aware, like both socially and politically, but like kind of intimately about what's at stake, both with your body and your relation with material, and also not making sense in a lot of the logic that is around us, then you'll know. Like, I don't know, I feel like my hands are better at math than my brain is. And then with art, I can say that. I don't know how many like mathematicians, there are some, but I know a lot of the institutional stuff, you know? It would be less odd if I say I'm someone who loves math and I work for a bank, like, than to say I love math, so I started knitting. I think that's pretty weird. Anyway, I have a lot of feelings about this.
That is really interesting to think about. Especially like the last thing is that I think that crystallized it. I was a little confused in the middle, but I think often it is like the value. We think of math as like in the abstract, but its real world like implications are those like tied to labor and tied to economics and tied to capitalism. So
yeah, and I like the way I think about it. In University of Tehran, which is where I got my degree in computer science, we're in the math building, and I always laugh. I was like, literally, there was no lights. Like the campus is gorgeous, and we were like in the corners of the science department, which already had no lights. Biology had some light, but they just decided that mathematicians don't need, you know, like any sense of like joy, or like it literally everything got grim. And then I was also spending a lot of my time with the theater kids, which was like the exact opposite. I would walk across the campus and then everything was color. Everyone was in the backyard. I was like, why? But I remember there was this timeline. There was this like history of math, you know? And I'm pretty sure it was like almost all men, maybe one woman somewhere in this timeline. And I was also lucky. I was in Iran, so there was like some famous like Asian and Muslim mathematicians there, which like now looking back, I'm like, whoa, you know, but that was math and everything else. And like, if you were cool, at some point you might dare to mention Wittgenstein, mostly Russell, you know, but that was it. And then in the last couple of years, my YouTube has decided, sometimes I think YouTube thinks I'm like a 12-year-old boy who likes math. So it sends me a lot of like TED science stuff. Like, did you know? But it's like one of them was really interesting. It was about the history of algebra, the way we learn it. Like a lot of, was it algebra or calculus? I have to check. I don't know. I might be making this up. But it was all about how these like French mathematicians at a very specific time in the history of Europe, like in the height of like colonialism and enlightenment, were like, we have to like make a standard way of teaching math. And then there's this whole narrative around it. Like they made up a Russian guy who didn't exist. And they would write papers in the name of this Russian guy. You know, and I'm like, right, this is a field. It's a field of knowledge. And then we're learning it with an institution. And then, you know, sometimes I think about it. So interesting, studying art. And I used to like talk about it with my friends. Like when I was in grad school for visual arts, and then suddenly a lot of my friends were getting their PhDs in mathematics. The same person that loved the proof. Years later, I remember we met again in a cafe in Tehran. He was getting his PhD in math in France. I was getting my MFA in art in New York. And I asked him, I was like, do you think about how you're outside this history, like this whole structure? You know? And I was like, with visual art, I'm very aware of it. Like almost every class I went to, we were either an exception or prehistory. We might get one page somewhere, right? And then there's this like impossible task.
Yeah.
You're both too late and too early. You have to work to catch up, but you're never within, you know? And I told him, I was like, it feels like accents, you know? I will always be like kind of a foreigner to that very specific like Western value of how we understand like hegemonic art history. And I asked him, I was like, as a mathematician, I was like, as an artist who's getting trained in New York, I'm aware of that. As an Iranian mathematician studying in France, do you think about like language, accents, histories? And it was really interesting because he was like, well, there's definitely different accents of mathematics, but wherever I get my PhD, like I'll be a French thinker, which is so interesting because with visual art, I don't think we think that way.
Yeah, we don't. I don't think we do.
And I think maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing. I feel like we had elders that tried and they were like, okay, that's not really a thing, you know? And it was so, I mean, I still think about it because then a few years later talking to him, he was like, Yasi, can you recommend books about colonialism? I was like, what happened? You know, and that was after a couple of years of working in institutions, like feeling that alienation. So it's so interesting because on some level, I think we work, like at least my work deals with two fields that are relatively like deeply conservative. I don't know how critical of itself academic mathematics is necessarily. You know, like I don't know how many courses they take about like the history of pedagogy and math. What are different histories of mathematics that have been erased? But then in my like weird YouTube videos, it started sending me, like it was like interviews with different mathematicians about, I think, a concept like countable and uncountable infinities, something like that. Like something that I am interested in. And then I was talking to undergraduate students, grad students, PhD students, adjunct professors, and then like a dean somewhere. So it's like this very specific line of like value and labor within the institution. And in the beginning, they explained it in like strict binaries, like this is right, this is wrong. And then it gained more and more complexity. And by the time it got to like the dean or the director or whatever, she was like, well, but like mathematics is like abstract art, like we make it up. And it was so interesting after all these years suddenly hearing this, because my friends used to say it. But then it was like, they're saying abstract art as if that's a singular thing that we all agree on, as if it's a thing we can hold, you know, like, oh, right, like that's abstract art. It was crossing the street. As if the term abstract art isn't in itself loaded with the question of embodiment, labor, alienation, histories of erasure, obsession with figuration and representation. Like, it's so loaded. Anyway, I have a lot, but that also to say, I'm very grateful for a lot of courses I took in fields like Middle Eastern studies, anthropology, where they are very self-critical of their own history within the institution, and they allow you to think critically about like systems of knowledge. Mathematicians get very mad at you if you tell them that they also exist within a history. They love the idea of a pure truth, and I don't trust things that are
That's
pure.
fair.
I think they have very specific histories. But I also more and more think art history in itself can be fairly conservative. But that's a different problem.
That's really, really interesting. I just want to know, you talked about how your work
Mm-hmm.
exists in spaces that are really like conservative, but I think a lot of your influences come from like Iranian architecture, and you talk about imbibing your own like memory and like the language and like labor through the hand within your work. So I
Yeah.
was wondering if like, is that the reason that you're making a conscious decision to do that?
I mean, it's so funny because I do think as fields of study, I think that's what I meant. That it's like both mathematics and on a certain level, art history as fields of studies have like, for me, much more potential to think of themselves like structurally in a critical way, you know?
Yeah.
And I think a lot can become possible in that way. With that said, I've been so lucky. Like, I feel like especially in the last like 4 years, I have worked with such incredible people, like absolute weirdos that like have invited me to places, have given me platforms, created my shows, wrote something, have been in conversation with me. Like sometimes I think about it, I'm like, they made worlds possible for me. And that can be mentors, it can be students, it can be program directors, it could be like artist run spaces, it could be curators that are artists, you know? So I say art history is very specific, but I believe in the gathering of artists, and especially
Yeah.
as contemporary artists in this like really weird world we live in. The second part of what you asked, I don't know how conscious any of my decisions have been. You know, one time one of my beloved friends, who's also an engineer kind of within the field, we were drinking tea late at night, Iranian style, you know? And he was like, you know, Yasi, your problem is, and I was like, I did not tell you I have a problem, but tell me. And he was like, you need a hobby. I was like, it's so funny because being an artist, like, it's all related. He was like, you need to have like he was like, I do rock climbing and then I go to work and then like I read something, but they're all separate. And I'm like, art is so intense, like it's
Yeah.
all related. It's like
Exactly.
everything feeds to everything. And you have to constantly recenter your values and be like, wait, but like how are they all related? What am I showing up with? Like what my intentions are?
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know how conscious any of the decisions were. Like life has been fairly random, and then very grateful that I have a process that allows me to go back and keep doing my things. There has been a lot of incredible people that like I feel like I have like a lot of gratitude and a lot of debts to. Yeah.
That's really interesting to hear. I think it's also really beautiful because it's like I was reading about I think the situationalist movement, and a lot of it talks about how art being treated as like, you know, singular contributions of like individuals and genius also applies to
Mm-hmm.
math. Like it also does apply to
Mm-hmm.
math, even though especially in like Asian countries and just like places that were not in
Mm-hmm.
Europe, the way that math developed was through like communal knowledge a lot of times.
Mm-hmm.
So it's
Yeah.
really, really beautiful to hear you say
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I think about it. I'm like, I was reading this book about a mathematician. I think the book is called The Man Who Loved Only Numbers, and the mathematician's name is Erdosh. It was a beautiful book, and it was really lovely to read it. But it kind of got me thinking. I was like, part of me understand how some of the most incredible mathematicians in the world were kind of monks, you know? Because it's a lot about like being like listening to a lot of this knowledge that exists,
Yeah.
and then being humble to receive it and kind of not make it your own.
Yeah.
And then thinking about like doing it like over and over and over again. Yeah. And then it's been so interesting. It's like, as much as I talk about these different fields, like in the past year, I at the Dartmouth talk, I mentioned it. I had a chance to be in conversation with different textile artists. And I'm like, that whole world, it is computer science. It is pure mathematics. And a few weeks ago in my residency at Dartmouth, I got a chance to talk to one of the math professors here. And I was just like really interested because he works with like complicated geometry, and he wrote a lot about fibers.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, that's interesting for me. Like the way he talked about it felt related. And then he came and saw the show, and it was really funny to talk to each other and like finding ways of like finding language to speak to each other. But I asked him about like fibers and how he thinks about them. And he was like, yeah, like thinking about the surface or the paper as the two-dimensional, and then like understanding different dimensionalities and like kind of complex surfaces.
Yeah.
But then he was like, yeah, but like there is the within the surface. And the fibers can be short and the fibers can be long. And I was like, wait, have you ever made paper? And he looked at me like in complete shock. And he was like, no. And I was like, like the way fiber is made, like the way textile is made, it is about the woven.
Yeah.
But the way a lot of, especially East Asian paper is made, it's like about picking up the fiber. So they kind of collect fiber, so it's not like a grid in that way, you know. But he hadn't, you know. But it was so close. He was like, some of them are short, some of them are long, and I was like, this. And of course, like the way he writes it is like way above my like pay grade. Like I can't read the mathematic papers, you know. But when he was leaving, I was like, I really hope you find some beautiful paper in your life. And he was like, I'm not as dexterous as you are. And it's true, like a lot of mathematicians like don't make things, or if they do, they think about it as a separate space. But these fields are like deeply related, you know? And like, but I mention all of this, like, I think a movement that, like, I felt, like, instantly connected to, you know, especially being in New York, like, thinking about the Fluxes, the Minimalists, like, that whole generation. And especially, I remember the first time I saw Dorothea Rockburn's work, and I had a chance to be in conversation with her a couple of times. And I never forget this, like, studying her and then interviewing her and then hanging out with her. She studied at the Black Mountain College. There was a mathematician. Max Stan like just showed up. He taught math to all those weirdo artists. And then Dorothea said that the way he taught it, he would just walk in the woods. And the mathematician found Dorothea. He was like, why aren't you coming to my classes? And she was like, I don't think it's my space. And he was like, let's go for a walk. Let's look at things, you know? And the way she talks about math, it's about dance. It is about the fluxes.
Yeah.
It's about improvisation, you know? So I think it's like very limited to separate these things.
That makes sense. I definitely agree. Just to wrap this up, one final question. I asked everyone this, but what are like conversations and like artists in like working right now, like in the contemporary space that you are particularly like interested in?
I love that question. A lot of people. So Trinity Minha's writing has been really important for me. For me, it started with her essay called Grandma Stories and Woman Native Other. And I highly recommend that to everyone. It's also a free PDF you can find online. but also she has such a specific way of finding language that is so inspiring, and thinking about things deeply and profoundly without simplifying or without like compromising the feelings of things. I brought some Agnes Martin writing, and she's blowing my mind. I'm reading Jack Whitten's writing, and that's been really inspiring. It's funny because I usually don't focus this much on reading visual artists, but they're good. They're good. And then some people. Alexis Pauline Gumbs is another like poet, thinker. She writes a lot about water in a way that I think is so profound. Pamela Sneed has been a mentor, and she's an incredible poet and someone with like a courageous heart that has been very inspiring. There's so many people I love. Alexis Pauline Gumbs also wrote a book that is an autobiography of Audre Lorde, and of course Audre Lorde has been very important for me. And the biography is gorgeous and really profound. I think it's called Survival is a Promise. So that's also been a friend these days in the studio. Yeah.
That's lovely.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. It was really
Of
interesting
course.
to hear about all your thoughts and your work and everything. Thank you so much for doing this.
It's been such a joy. Thank you so much for inviting me.